Bom, pessoal, vamos começar então. Boa noite a todos, bem-vindos ao segundo dia da Escola Anual de Ciências de Aprendizagem, da Aprendizagem 2026. A gente está super animado de ter tanta gente aqui voltando hoje e de ter hoje professoras incríveis, super importantes na área das ciências da aprendizagem que vão compartilhar com a gente um pouco sobre visões de aprendizagem, né? O que é aprendizagem nas perspectivas das ciências da aprendizagem, e também, né, um pouco sobre como a gente pode criar submissões, né, escrever artigos para a Conferência das Ciências da Aprendizagem que estejam alinhados, né, aos temas de interesse, né, às formas, né, esperadas, enfim, como criar uma boa submissão para a conferência, esperando incentivar mais submissões do Brasil, né, mais contribuições de vocês para o campo das ciências da aprendizagem. Então, hoje, né, só para começar um pouco, falar um pouquinho da logística, a gente pede que todos mantenham o microfone desligado, mas, se possível, mantenham as câmeras ligadas, né, para quem puder, para a gente se ver, né, as professoras que vão participar dos painéis e das falas vão querer interagir também, então é legal a gente manter a câmera ligada. Se houver algum momento, né, onde seja incentivada a comunicação direta com vocês, né, daí vocês podem desligar o microfone e falar. A gente está com uma tradução simultânea disponível, já mostro para vocês como ativar, para quem não estava no último encontro. E perguntas, né, para as professoras, a gente quer que vocês façam perguntas, né? As sessões estão planejadas para serem bem interativas, né? Então tem momentos de fala, mas muitos momentos para que a gente possa dialogar com vocês. Então façam no chat as perguntas, né? À medida que vão aparecendo, vocês podem ir colocando no chat, depois a gente sumariza, sintetiza, seleciona se precisar para que as professoras respondam as perguntas de vocês. Se vocês tiverem alguma pergunta sobre o curso ou sobre a plataforma, vocês podem acessar esse link, né? Para perguntas mais técnicas, não coloquem no chat, a gente responde em outro canal. E aí, só para lembrar, né? Para quem se inscreveu lá na plataforma, né? A ideia é entrar direto pelo Zoom. E aí vocês vão ter um certificado e a possibilidade de mentoria, participando dos encontros e cumprindo as tarefas que estão lá na plataforma. Inclusive, tinha uma tarefa para hoje. Quem que está aqui fez a tarefa? Levanta a mão ou põe um joinha. Bastante gente fez a tarefa, né, de compartilhar uma imagem. Olha quantas mãos! Compartilhar uma imagem, né, que representasse a aprendizagem para vocês, que a gente compartilhou também com a professora Sharon, essas imagens. E aí, para quem não se inscreveu, as aulas, né, vão estar disponíveis no YouTube, no canal das Ciências da Aprendizagem Brasil. E aí, então, para quem, né, quiser usar o recurso de tradução simultânea, vocês podem ativar isso, né, lá embaixo no Zoom. No meu, pelo menos, é assim. Às vezes tem alguma mudança, né, assim, dependendo da máquina que vocês estão usando, da versão do Zoom, mas em geral vocês vão lá no mais, vão no globinho, clicam em interpretação e escolhem o canal em português, e aí vocês vão ouvir tudo que as professoras falarem em inglês vai ser traduzido automaticamente não, ser traduzido pelo José, nosso maravilhoso tradutor simultâneo, daí vocês ouvem em português. Então, só para lembrar um pouquinho, né, sobre a mentoria, quem tiver inscrito na plataforma, né, tiver acompanhando os encontros e realizando as tarefas, né, vai estar apto a participar da seleção para mentoria. Porém, tivemos um anúncio anteontem, se eu não me engano, a ISLS publicou o Call for Papers, né, a chamada para trabalhos para a conferência de 2027, que vai acontecer na Índia, e acho que vai ser uma conferência muito legal. Em geral, esse deadline é em novembro, e a gente tinha se planejado para fazer a mentoria pensando que a submissão seria em novembro, mas mudou para o dia 9 de outubro. Então a gente perdeu algumas semaninhas aí no prazo de submissão, e a gente vai ajustar o cronograma da mentoria para dar conta desse período mais curto, e a gente manda para vocês depois tudo isso lá pela plataforma mesmo. Então, gente, hoje, né, a gente vai discutir o que a gente pesquisa na ciência da aprendizagem, concepções de aprendizagem, teorias que são empregadas na área, na primeira parte, principalmente, que vai ser uma fala da professora Sharon Ainsworth, e depois como estruturar um trabalho para a Conferência Internacional de Ciências da Aprendizagem, onde a gente vai ter um painel mediado pela professora Deborah Fields, com a participação das professoras Gayatri Jayatirtha e Hilary Swenson. Então, para a gente começar, né, eu quero convidar a professora Sharon Ainsworth para fazer uma fala. Vou começar apresentando ela e depois passo a palavra para Sharon. Então, a doutora Sharon Ainsworth é professora na Universidade de Nottingham, no Reino Unido. Ela é cofundadora e atual diretora do seu Instituto de Pesquisa em Ciências da Aprendizagem, e os seus interesses de pesquisa estão centrados em aprendizagem representacional, especialmente na aprendizagem por meio de desenhos e de tecnologias interativas, incluindo jogos educacionais. Ela escreveu mais de 150 livros, capítulos e artigos e orientou 25 estudantes de doutorado, sempre na área das ciências da aprendizagem. Antes de passar para Sharon, Renato, desculpa perguntar que eu não estou vendo o Zoom. O Paulo está por aí? Será que ele quer fazer alguma fala?
Acho que ele não entrou ainda.
Então
Tinha
tá,
essa reunião com
tá bom. Então eu
o
vou parar de
founder, né?
compartilhar minha tela e convidar a professora Sharon a começar a fala dela. Sharon, as perguntas as pessoas podem ir colocando no chat, a gente lê ao final da sua fala, ou você quer ter algum tipo de interação durante a fala com os participantes, como você achar melhor.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bit where I've planned to try and get some feedback around an image of learning so I set myself the same homework that you guys were set, although I've cheated and I found somebody else's. So we're definitely there. And then obviously clarification questions when I forget myself and go jargony before we get there. And I'm just going to bumble around and try and share my screen. So let's hope that's going to work. And that looks like the right one. And pop here. Somebody just give me a quick shout if it looks like what you were expecting. Thank you, Hilary. So thanks very much for inviting me. And in a way, thank you also for giving me the title that I needed to talk to, because normally you just rock up and you talk to what you normally talk to. But this time you actually asked me to think about something and make explicit something that I probably only often keep implicit, which is what conceptions of learning do I think are important in the learning sciences, and how do they sort of form the scope of inquiry within the learning sciences? So I've kind of interpreted that as how our views of learning shape our research questions, our methods, and have implications for our educational practice. And I've essentially ripped off my co-authors here. So this year we published a book on introducing the learning sciences, written for people who weren't currently learning scientists. And I wrote that with Price Davis, Peter Woods, Jonathan Halls, and Lenka Schnaubert. And I've sort of stolen some of the ideas that we put into this book for tonight's presentation. So all the good bits are mine, or the bad bits are theirs. So, why do conceptions of learning even matter? And actually, the minute you start thinking about it, you start to realize that they could shape your entire research and potentially teaching enterprise. They make you think about what learning is. For learning sciences in particular, they ask us where learning occurs. We're not just a lab science, we're a science which takes the context where learning happens really seriously. I just need to hide your lovely faces because otherwise I can't see my own slides. Go back. What counts as evidence of learning? Again, our conceptions of learning make us look in completely different places. What methods are appropriate to answer the research methods that we want to answer? For me, what teaching is valued, and how is learning assessed. For me, sort of all of these come from an often implicit conception of what learning is. And I would probably summarize it, if you made me put it on a t-shirt, is our conceptions of learning matter because they tell us what questions are worth answering. And it's quite fashionable in the learning sciences to worry about whether we're a broad tent, which I don't know how well that translates into Portuguese, whether it's a common phrase or not, but the idea is whether you have a very single idea and a very fixed notion, or whether you have a broad tent where everybody is welcome. And I would say, if I stand back from this broad tent and look at its brief history, if I put the birth date of the learning sciences around the early 90s, which I think could be argued to be true, I would say that behaviorism had mostly fallen out of fashion prior to the inception of the learning sciences. We were no longer focused, as we had been from sort of 1900 to 1956, on behavioral explorations of learning. I would also say that whilst cognitive accounts remain dominant in the early periods of the learning sciences, you could also see that information processing accounts, the idea that the mind exists to process symbols, was also waning, and that there were more richer views of cognition. And whenever I say waning, because I think learning sciences is a broad tent, it doesn't mean that I think we've completely abandoned these earlier conceptions, but I think we've probably expanded on these conceptions, and some of them have fallen in and out of favor. But if I was to look around today, I would say most people who talk about gamification are actually using behaviorist principles without necessarily noticing. So I don't think anything has completely gone away, but at the moment, I think we're very much in the era of cognitive theory, which draws upon extended approaches. And I'll come back to this, but essentially it is the idea, the environment where you are thinking and the body with which you are thinking matter. Then as we moved through the 90s, we had what we called the cultural turn in the learning sciences, where we sort of change our focus to individual learnings in context to how communities learn. And I think we've changed our focus again recently to critical theories of learning, which ask the question, who's learning, whose knowledge, whose interests are being served? And I think there are definitely other theories and other paradigms of learning out there, but I think these are the dominant ones as we approach, 2030. So just whizzing through the prehistory, as I call it, of the learning sciences, if we were to look at behavioral accounts and behavior change, we would be talking about things like, what habits do people have? What skills? What performance are they doing? And how are their response patterns different? And we wouldn't just be talking about people, there would be a lot of emphasis on non-human animals. So there would be lots of rats running through mazes to help us understand learning. And then if we change our attention to information processing, perhaps the concepts we use in knowledge acquisition are still used today. So we now turn our attention away from habits to knowledge, to concepts, to ideas like expertise, and to ideas like memory. But landing where I think we currently are, I would say that the dominant cognitive paradigm at this point within the learning sciences is that learning is embodied, by which I mean learning is enhanced by action, but also learning is for action. We didn't evolve to read books in a library or process symbols. We evolved to act, and our cognitive processes are for action. So this kind of leads us with some core assumptions. Things like perception and action just really matter. The body and the environment really matter. And the memories we form are not decontextualized symbols, but they are directly related to our sensory motor experiences. And that leads to sort of questions that we see that come out of an embodied perspective would be things like, And these, there could be 100 research questions, 1,000 research questions, but typically things like, how does gesture support learning? How do actions shape thinking? And not just how do artifacts help change our understanding, but from an embodied perspective, how does the interaction with artifacts change our understanding? So I think that's one claim I want to make for where the learning sciences is. I think we're currently an embodied cognitive field. For me, yeah, I'm biased, but the more I think about it, the more I think this bias is defendable. I think we perhaps underestimate the extent to which learning is representational. So I think learning often occurs through the creation and interpretation of representations. We learn to represent and we represent to learn. If you look into the history of education as a formal system, for example, we find that formal educational systems emerged soon after written notation. So we didn't need schooling systems until we learned to represent. And now that we've learned to represent, much of our formal schooling system is about learning to represent and learning with representations. Because representations extend our cognition. When we use diagrams, virtual reality, augmented reality, when we pick up a pencil and draw a mark on a piece of paper, we're changing the way we think. And I claim, and you can definitely argue with me about this later, that technologies change representations and practices with those representations, but maybe not fundamentally. So for me, a line of chalk on a cave wall is very, very similar to a pencil on a piece of papyrus, and very, very similar to a stylus on a tablet screen. And of course, there are things you can do with a stylus on a tablet screen. You can rotate it, you can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can rub it out really quickly and re-edit. But fundamentally, it's all about, in this example, taking a line and using it to make meaning in the external environment. So I think they do change as our technologies change, but perhaps not as fundamentally as we typically claim when we invent a new representational form and practice. So typical questions in this paradigm would be, does drawing support learning? Or how does drawing support learning? Which representational practices in which field matter? What makes representations powerful cognitive and cultural tools? And again, I could have 1,000 more. And then the third theme I'd like to say that I think is quite dominant in the learning sciences is learning is relational. So learning involves changing identities and learning involves participation. So again, you could fill 72 slides with these kind of ideas, but to briefly summarize, learners are part of activity systems and relationships are part of learning, and more than part of learning, relationships are often what is learned. And participation doesn't just change you as an individual, it changes the communities that you participate in. So typical research questions we might see in this situation would be, how does participation change learners, and how does learners change the communities they participate in? How do communities change over time? But how do power relationships shape people's opportunities to learn? So I'm going to say that a defendable position is that we have three current dominant paradigms within the learning sciences. As I've said, behavioral and acquisitional models are still there, but less key to the field as they would have been when I came in back in the very early 90s. So, we no longer focus primarily on behavior change using observational methods. There is still quite a lot of acquisition type models out there looking at knowledge change, and you might see those implications for methods. It's certainly the case that if you look at the history of the Journal of the Learning Sciences, experiments have decreased in favor since the journal's inception. But I would imagine if I looked in 2026, there's probably still some experiments in there, and modeling comes in and out of fashion. But embodied approaches, we sort of change the key metaphor here to being what coordinated action are we interested in? And therefore, we might be looking at things like gesture analysis and eye tracking. And this might be within observational or experimental paradigms, but it adds process data as well. With representation, our question isn't how does knowledge change, but how is meaning making achieved through representation? And to do that, we really need to do close-grained artifact or discourse analysis, for example. And then with relational approaches, we might be asking, how does participation and identity transform through the learning processes? And again, you can see you can ask or answer a question like that experimentally. You'd be looking at techniques like ethnography or interaction analysis. And when you look at these questions and you look at these concepts and you look at these methods, one of the things that often stands out to me is that they operate over different timescales. So the learning sciences is renowned at being able to explain phenomena both at the microsecond and at the millennia. But our methods are often not suitable for all of those different timescales. When we look at learning in an experimental situation, we're often looking at things in a tightly controlled lab. But that doesn't work for ethnography. So our methods are appropriate to different designs, and sometimes they can be incompatible. So one time I was working with some science educators in Sweden. They wanted to do an experiment, but they also wanted to talk to half of the people in their experiment because they wanted to do some conversational analysis. And of course, from an experimental perspective, that's a confound in your experiment. So it's not always the case that we can throw all of the methods in at one time. But the thing I really, really strongly believe is that no method is inherently superior. I just think it's about fitting the methods to the question you want to ask. And those questions are driven by our conceptions of learning. So many of you did some homework. I asked you to draw an image of what you think learning is. And sorry, my dog is chasing a fly. Oh, good, he's set the robot off. This is fun. 1 second, I need to pick the robot up before my dog chases the robot across the kitchen. Why did you do that, dog? Thank you. You just sit there. Good. You've had time to look at that image, which I completely planned whilst the dog chased the robot. So this photograph for this postcard, I don't know how many of you have ever seen it before. It was drawn by Jean-Marc Cotet for the 1900s World Fair in Paris. And he did a series of postcards, but this is the one that he imagined for the future of education. Now, his future of education is now 25 years in our past. So this is what he imagined learning looking like at the turn of the millennium. And I'd love to hear your reactions to that, but I think when we look at it, perhaps through the lenses of embodiment, representation, and relational conceptions of learning, we can sort of see what's missing in this. I can't currently see the chat, so if anybody's responding on the chat, somebody might need to
So Sharon, I'll take a look at the chat and
Thank you.
I'm saying to you. So Juliana is saying, Se eu falar em português, você entende, Sharon? Or not?
Thank you,
Ah,
Jose.
se eu falar em português, você entende? Ah. Então, Juliana falou: parece o que as empresas de IA generativa estão fazendo, mas com a gente. O Leonardo falou: o fator humano está faltando. A
Yeah,
Lorena falou: falta interação. A Camille falou:
there is no.
falta alegria. The joy is missing. A Maria Luísa falou: eu acho que as relações entre os estudantes e as pessoas estão faltando. A Paola falou: a infraestrutura relacional que a Cris Gutierrez falou com a gente na semana passada está faltando totalmente.
Yeah. Some things over the time that I've noticed additionally, where are the women?
Good one.
So, only males are being envisaged as needing an education in this future of 2000. Everybody is, of course, completely stationary. The kids all look bored out of their minds, don't they? I mean, they just look so bored. And nobody's representing. Everybody is sitting there, not externalizing their cognition in any way, shape, or form. Now, I'm not an expert on 19th century Parisian fashion. You'll be unsurprised to learn. But I suspect that the fact that the boy turning the handle is in long trousers is showing us he's not actually a scholar, that he's a worker employed to churn the learning into the students, because the others, if you can see, they're in short trousers and breeches, and of course there's the old white guy just feeding the wisdom into the funnel to be pumped into the heads of our sitting stationary bored students. So this isn't the learning that I think the learning sciences is interested in. I think we're interested in embodied learning, which privileges action, perception, materiality. I think we're interested in representational learning. We're privileging meaning making and externalization. And fundamentally, we're interested in relationships. So we're fundamentally interested in participation, identity, power, and communication. And community. So if I had to put it on a t-shirt, I'd say for me, learning is action, it's meaning, it's participation. And again, I am a hideous cherry picker. I'm a stealer of other people's ideas and integrator, because I think actually one of the reasons I love the learning sciences is that we try and advance through integration rather than theoretical victory. I'm not here to say representational learning is the only way to learn and nobody should care about relationships and embodiment. I think we work well as a field when we learn with each other and from each other. But if this is our view of learning, why do our classrooms still resemble so frequently the one I've just shown you? And why, when I look in most policymakers' visions for education in most countries, do they still mostly resemble at school the vision for 2000, which we all in the learning sciences dislike? What is so powerful about that particular vision of learning that makes it so difficult for people like us, and I assume everybody on this call today is probably feeling that, to do something about? And I suppose I'll leave you with one last slide, which is, although I was asked to talk about implications research, I was thinking about how my conceptions of learning shape recommendations for teachers. And fundamentally, I am not a principles kind of person. I think principles disempower teachers too much. So certainly in England, when we have beginning teachers, quite often we ask teachers, is teaching art, is teaching science? But over the last few years, I've been reading a lot of metaphors for teaching and learning, some visual, some not visual. And one of the ones I'm really drawn to is the idea that teaching is architecture. So teaching is about principled knowledge developed in labs, but teaching is also about artistic expression, creativity, aesthetics. Teaching is about adapting to the context in which you find yourself. And teaching is about building something new, but most importantly, perhaps, teaching, like architecture, everybody deserves good architecture and everybody deserves good teaching. It shouldn't matter how much money is available if you're thinking about it. So I'm going to say, I don't want to give you principles that come from these conceptions of learning. I want to empower people to be architects of their own and others' learning. And that's me done.
Amazing, thank you so much. Muito obrigada, Sharon, pela sua fala, foi muito inspiradora. O pessoal que gostou bastante aqui. No chat falaram, gostaram muito da metáfora, né, dessa de ensinar como arquitetura. E a Mariana Reis falou no nosso grupo de estudos aqui na PUC, a gente chama os professores, né, de artesãos, né? Então, ensinar como algo relacionado ao artesanato, né, artesanato. E vou falar para o pessoal
Yeah.
colocar perguntas aqui no chat, comentários, coisas que vocês gostariam de compartilhar com a Sharon. E se alguém quiser abrir o microfone e fazer a pergunta em português, pode fazer também para a gente interagir. Enquanto o pessoal vai pensando aí em perguntas, Sharon, eu queria te perguntar o que que trouxe você para as ciências da aprendizagem, né? Como que você conheceu esse campo e que migrou, né, tão para o centro desse campo? O que que te encantou? O que que te chamou a atenção nas ciências da aprendizagem? Ou se você, né, ajudou a construir também o campo, como que foi um pouco esse processo?
Okay, thank you. So I guess I got lucky. So many of you may have heard the word scaffolding, scaffolding theory. So scaffolding as a metaphor for education was developed by David Wood and Jerry Bruner and others in the 70s. And David Wood was my PhD advisor. So my introduction to learning sciences was scaffolded by a really good scaffolding theorist. So the institute that I now direct actually started itself in 1992. So we've been doing learning sciences at Nottingham since the early 90s. So I've sort of never had a choice. It's always been there. And I'm somebody with a background in chemistry, artificial intelligence, psychology, and my chair is in education. So for me, learning sciences gives me the opportunity to embrace lots of different identities while still doing the same job. So sometimes I code, sometimes I program, sometimes I play with children, sometimes I go into medical school labs and get people to draw in dissection. And I am somebody who gets bored really easily, really quickly. And I think learning sciences offers me the opportunity to never be bored because there's always something new and interesting to play with. And you grow all the time. And to some extent, that's a bit scary because you're kind of like, I've been doing this a long time. Don't I know enough now? Do I have to learn more? But yeah, you do have to learn more. There's always more to learn. So it's basically fun.
Maravilhoso, maravilhoso. Muito obrigada, Sharon. A Mariana quer fazer uma pergunta. Mariana, fica à vontade para abrir seu microfone.
Obrigada, Cássia. Vocês conseguem me ouvir? So Sharon, I was taking notes while you spoke, and also from the previous class, and the videos that we watched. And I just wanted to share a comment with you that I now feel included when we read and understand about a little bit more about learning science, because when I started my PhD research, my advisor didn't want to advise me because he said my investigation was too practical, too pragmatic, and it was not a PhD research. So seeing how practical research can be and that it is recognized as a field, a respected field, makes me feel more like I belong somewhere. So I just wanted to share that with you and just understand how it was for you. Did you also feel like dislocated until you found learning science and you found your space to be like multidisciplinary, as you just mentioned?
I guess I got lucky because I found an advisor who really, really believed in learning sciences before many people believed in learning sciences. So to that extent, I was very lucky. But one thing I would say to you, I don't know whether you've ever heard this phrase, use-inspired basic research. So the idea behind use-inspired basic research is it's not translational research. It's not research that is done in the lab and now let's find a use for it in the real world. It's not blue skies research aiming to understand something that has no practical value. It's research done in something called Pasteur's quadrant, the guy who invented vaccines. So use-inspired basic research for me is a really nice way of thinking about what a lot of learning sciences is up for, because we're trying to ask interesting theoretical questions in the context of use. We want to be useful, we want to inform theory. We can go back to, again, the very early history of the learning sciences and talk about humble theory, the idea that we want to develop theory, but we want to develop theory that's useful in a particular context. So get your advisor and make them read about Pasteur and ask them whether you think Pasteur is not a decent scientist.
E leve o seu professor para a Conferência das Ciências da Aprendizagem também. Obrigada, Sharon. Vou fazer duas perguntas do chat, Sharon, e daí você escolhe por qual você quer começar ou se você quer combiná-las. O Jorge perguntou: como você percebe a influência das tecnologias educacionais nas ciências da aprendizagem? Como elas ajudam, como elas atrapalham? E a Sabrina Gonçalves perguntou: na sua opinião, quais são os conhecimentos essenciais para um professor ser um arquiteto da aprendizagem?
Okay, so ed tech, how does it help learning? So I guess for me, educational technology, we don't just need to say digital, a pencil itself is a technology, so these tools are ways that we can extend our cognition. I do have a degree in AI. I haven't particularly adopted generative AI within my practice. And I don't quite know why I'm so reluctant. It's partly because all of the technologies, in my view, in edtech technologies have always been cultural tools and cognitive tools with us in control. And I guess I still remain a little hesitant about Gen AI. So they provide us with metaphors, they provide us with ways to extend our cognition, they connect us. I am sitting in my kitchen in Devon, in England, late at night, but I couldn't be talking to you without this form of technology. I do really worry that the pandemic reified a kind of digital version of the ideal classroom that we looked at a couple of slides ago, where everybody was just sitting on Zoom calls and Teams calls, passively absorbing information that was being tipped into their waiting brains. And again, I think a lot of policymakers took that up, but I'm not a technical determinist. We can do with the technology what we want to do with the technology. So metaphor, powerful tool, we should keep in control. We shouldn't just let the rich white capitalists tell us what technology is good for. The second question has gone from my short-term memory. Could somebody re-ask it?
Sim, a segunda pergunta é sobre o que. Só um minutinho. Quais são os conhecimentos essenciais para um professor ser um arquiteto da aprendizagem?
I think one of the most challenging things for teachers is that almost everything's essential. You know, this is why I wrote when I was writing in the book, I wrote that teachers deserve the vast salaries that they are paid all over the world. And then somebody actually made me write open brackets, ha ha, in case people didn't realize I was being sarcastic. Copy editors. But I think you have to know a huge amount, but if I would go back to it, I guess I would go, when I teach my teachers, I say, what we really want to do is think about how we make meaning through action and how we make meaning through relationships. So I would probably come back to that trio of action, relationship, and extending cognition. But there's just so much, you know, there's so much principled knowledge for every single thing you do, which is why I just can't cope with principles. I just think you have to give metaphors and empower people to draw on some fundamental knowledge, but know how to adapt to the context and the environment that they find themselves in. Bad answer. It's too tough.
É uma pergunta muito difícil. Vou ler mais uma pergunta aqui do chat da Paola. Paola, você quer falar sua pergunta? Prefere que eu leia?
Posso falar
É uma pergunta longa, então talvez se você falar fique mais fluido.
em português ou em inglês?
Em português.
Tá. Sharon, difícil falar português para Sharon. Você falou sobre análise muito granular de artefatos, né? Quando você está fazendo pesquisa na área das ciências da aprendizagem. E a gente que trabalha com implementação de formações de professores, enfim, a gente tem muitos artefatos muito relevantes, às vezes, para analisar. Só que é um mundo de coisas e para essa análise granular, a gente precisa de muito tempo, que a gente também não tem nesse processo de design-based research que você está implementando e analisando e fazendo tudo ao mesmo tempo agora.
Uhum.
Eu não sei, você tem dicas, ideias, sugestões de como olhar de forma assim granular para esses artefatos muito interessantes? E se vocês, no campo da ciência da aprendizagem, estão usando inteligência artificial também para ajudar com a análise de artefatos?
Well, people definitely are. I mean, and people definitely are using AI prior to the last 4 years or whatever, when it's re-exploded. You know, some of the stuff that I really loved maybe 10, 15 years ago now was chemistry tutors that analyzed the drawings that students made when they were solving chemistry problems. This is Melanie Cooper's work called Be Socratic. It was a prototype, but she developed it because she had 5,000 students in her general chemistry class. So if you have 5,000 students in your general chemistry class, but you believe that it's an important practice to get beginning chemists to draw, not just to answer multiple choice questions, you look for ways that technology can interpret the gestures, the visualizations, the drawings. So, as a researcher, I have the luxury of studying representations that people create in a lot of detail, really in depth. In my day job as an educator, I don't. But nonetheless, I do find that when people produce visual representation for me, I typically can assess understanding more quickly from a visual representation for reasons that you would have to come to a completely different talk for than I can in writing, because visual representations are specific. They exploit perceptual processes. You can process them a lot more in parallel. So I get a long way quickly from a drawing compared to text. But maybe I just like studying drawing, although I myself am a terrible artist.
Thank you so much. No, it was excellent to hear you.
Mas acho que dá tempo da gente fazer mais algumas perguntas aqui do chat. Então, a Maria Luísa está perguntando: o contexto organizacional, educação corporativa, pode ser objeto de estudo das ciências da aprendizagem, mesmo tendo uma natureza de transformação acelerada, especialmente a respeito dos conhecimentos valorizados?
Yeah, I mean, right back in the second slide, one of the things that is attractive about the learning sciences is that it does look at learning wherever that happens, be that in workplaces, be that in museums, be that in sports fields. I was maybe we should have spent more time looking at some of the images that you guys sent in, because I could see people learning in family kitchens. I could see people learning in the field. I could see there was one of a rabbit and a bird on a building that I didn't understand, and I would like to know what that meant. But a practical answer to your question is that, yeah, thank you very much. A practical answer to your question is that learning scientists often have to research where the funders want us to research. So there is an awful lot of research in STEM education, in what you would probably call K-12 and onwards to high school, and I would call something completely different. But there is learning sciences work in the workplace, although typically that workplace is an engineering or science-based workplace. There's a very little learning scientists studying fashion design or art history, and it happens, it is out there, but it's definitely dominated by engineering and science workplaces. So we do it, we're interested in it. Fundamentally, we research what we're paid to research. But if anybody is on the call and wants to claim an image and tell all of us what they were thinking when they proposed it, I would love to hear from some of you about some of these images of learning. George?
Bom, primeiro, muito obrigado. Muita coisa para pensar. E a figura que eu coloquei é essa no canto inferior direito, da mulher na academia fazendo uma eletroestimulação. E aí eu estava pensando em uma mediação docente que é aumentada por tecnologia.
Yeah.
E a ideia de ela está executando o músculo, ela não está terceirizando o esforço para a tecnologia, mas ela está usando a tecnologia para potencializar o exercício que ela tem que fazer. Então, ao invés de pensar no músculo da perna dela, a metáfora que eu faço é o esforço cognitivo para a aprendizagem.
Yeah. I don't know whether you've heard this metaphor yourselves recently, but when one metaphor for when you should use whether Gen AI or not is to think about whether you are in a gym trying to build your muscle, or whether you're at work trying to move a heavy thing from one side of the room to another. In the gym, you want to use your own muscle. You want to put that effort in. In the workplace, you just want to get the box moved. And I think that's a nice metaphor. If I can connect the last question to your image, to say, I use Gen AI when I want to get the box moved. I struggle in the gym when I want to improve my performance. And therefore, the technology is giving me feedback to improve my cognitive effort rather than replace it. So thank you, George.
Thank you.
Lorena, pode falar. Alexandre, se quiser falar também. Como eu estou compartilhando, eu não estou vendo vocês, mas. Ah, Lorena, vai lá. Lorena, a gente te ouve muito baixinho. Você consegue falar mais perto do microfone?
Eu vou desconectar, que eu acho que não foi.
Não, agora a gente não te ouve.
Me ouve melhor agora?
Muito. Agora tá ótimo.
Tá. Então, eu levantei a mão porque a imagem que eu coloquei foi a do coelho e da ave ali na parede do prédio. Essa é uma pintura que está na parede do prédio da Escola de Humanidades da universidade da qual eu participo, e é o prédio onde tem as licenciaturas, né? E no momento que eu fui fazer a atividade, eu olhei assim para o lado e enxerguei essa imagem e ela me conectou com o que eu estava fazendo ali naquele momento. Então, ela também passa para mim a ideia, né, o coelho sentado em cima dos livros, né, a ideia do conhecimento adquirido através, né, desse conhecimento acumulado, né, que os livros representam. E a ave com a mala cheia de etiquetas me transmite aquela imagem de aprendizagem através da experiência, da vivência, né, da exploração, né, do mundo e de tudo mais. E os dois conectando os dedos, né, numa metáfora da imagem de Michelangelo, lá da criação. Então, quando os dois se conectam, a aprendizagem se consolida. Então, foi isso que a imagem me remete, desde que essa imagem foi pintada lá na universidade, e aí é nisso que eu acredito também, né? Nessa conexão entre a experiência real vivida e a aprendizagem do conhecimento acumulado.
Thank you.
Vou passar para o Alexandre, só queria comentar, Lorena, sobre o que você falou. É interessante porque, à primeira vista, quando a gente olha essa imagem, ela parece um prédio, um coelho, né? Mas para mim me remete à aprendizagem o fato da gente ir olhando para os detalhes e destrinchando o que aquilo significa também, né? Então, como se a gente colocasse uma lente de contato na imagem e ela começa, né, a explodir em muitos significados, né? Isso para mim também me remete à aprendizagem, né? A gente ser capaz de olhar com outros olhos, né, para algo que é familiar, talvez, para gente. Muito legal. Alexandre?
Oi, boa noite. A minha imagem é a do canto inferior esquerdo, ali é um grafo, representado ali como um círculo, enfim, que tem os pontos conectados ali. essa imagem foi um exercício que eu fiz há alguns anos atrás a partir de projetos da Feira Brasileira de Ciências de Engenharia, né, a FEBRACE, tentando olhar um pouco como que os diversos projetos em categorias diferentes usam linguagem semelhante. E aí eles chegam, as linhas conectando os pontos, quanto mais fortes, mais similaridade tem os projetos. Então, para mim, isso representa aprendizagem porque eu acredito muito nessa visão interdisciplinar do conhecimento e achei que essa é uma imagem que representa bem isso. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Alexandre. A gente está quase no fim da sessão. Sabrina, se você quiser falar rapidinho da sua, e aí a Sharon pode falar as últimas palavras dela, e a gente passa para o próximo painel.
Tá joia. Eu quis trazer, compartilhar o meu por um aspecto diferente, eu acho que não foi citado. A minha imagem é essa que tem uma senhora e um menino, né, numa cozinha, logo ali no canto direito, né? E para mim, eu tenho estudado muito, eu tenho me dedicado muito a olhar para aspectos do fenômeno da aprendizagem, também passando pela percepção, pelo sensorial, pelo afetivo, pelo relacional, como experiências que ganham profundidade a partir da vivência ali. Então, comparei assim, uma aprendizagem como se fosse aqueles comfort foods, né? Então, a aprendizagem também nessa linha afetiva, vamos dizer assim, e quanto essas interações afetivas, né, que são cognitivas, mas também perpassam por outros aspectos, né, da experiência, elas marcam e podem ter uma capacidade de marcar com bastante profundidade, né? Então, você aprende ali em um ambiente totalmente tranquilo, familiar, como fazer um bolo com a sua avó, então o cheiro do bolo, o cheiro que te marca. Então, essa experiência, todo o fenômeno da experiência, então eu tenho tentado muito olhar para a proposta da aula, como é que vai, do ponto de vista da fenomenologia mesmo. Então, gostei muito até quando foi trazida a questão relacional, que é algo que tem me chamado a atenção.
Thank you.
Obrigada, pessoal. A gente está se encaminhando para o final dessa sessão. Sharon, queria te agradecer muito. Foi muito rica a sua sessão, a forma como você estruturou, né? E as conexões também com as experiências do público. Se você quiser fazer suas palavras finais.
Well, I think your images of learning are much richer than the vision of the future that we looked at earlier. So I thank you for sharing them. And if you have any explanation that goes underneath any of them that your hosts could forward to me, I'm sure Google can translate from Portuguese to English without you having to go to that effort yourselves. I'm afraid my Portuguese is non-existent. Well, I could say obrigada for inviting me, but that would be it.
Muito obrigada, Sharon. Foi muito bom ter você aqui com a gente. A gente sabe que está muito tarde para você, acho que é meia-noite, se eu não me engano, onde a Sharon está.
Yeah,
Então a Sharon vai agora partir
I will
e a
go,
gente
I'm
vai,
afraid.
vai. E agora a gente vai para um
Have a wonderful
painel.
rest of the session.
Muito obrigada, Sharon. Thank you so much. Uh, yes. So, yeah. Então a gente vai para a próxima sessão. Vou pedir uma ajuda, Renato, para você dar um pin na Deb, na Hillary e na Gayatri, se você puder me ajudar com essa
Claro.
parte técnica. E aí, então, deixa eu só abrir aqui. A gente vai ter agora na última hora um painel para a gente pensar, né, como que a gente estrutura uma submissão para ciências da aprendizagem. Quem vai conduzir esse painel é a professora Deborah Fields. Ela é professora pesquisadora de tecnologia instrucional e ciências da aprendizagem na Utah State University. E na sua pesquisa, a Débora inspira e defende que aprendizes estabeleçam conexões de identidade e aprendizagem entre espaços institucionais e cotidianos. Isso inclui projetar espaços para a expressão criativa dos aprendizes com mídias digitais, programação e materiais artesanais do dia a dia. Ela foi a principal desenvolvedora da unidade curricular de e-textiles ou e-textiles do Exploring Computer Science e participou de diversas formações docentes para apoiar as crianças a projetar e programar de maneiras criativas, mais recentemente com a auditoria de inteligência artificial. A Débora é autora de 2 livros publicados pela MIT Press, The Society That Learns, Constructionism and Lifelong Learning in Thailand, que acabou de ser publicado, e Connected Play, Twin Life in a Virtual World. Debbie, então passo para você a palavra, você conduz, certo? Apresenta a Hillary e a Gayatri, ou você quer que eu apresente elas?
I will introduce them. Thank you. I'm honored by that introduction. So I was invited to do this panel and I wanted to bring some colleagues. In particular, I wanted to make sure that we had people from different stages of careers. So I have an early career scholar, a mid-career scholar, and it still kind of blows my mind that I'm a senior scholar on this panel, but I'll own that for now. So we have all been attending ISLS conferences since graduate school, at least since our PhDs and maybe earlier for some. My first one was in 2006 when it was about 400 people in Indiana, and now it's, close to 1,000 people, and stuff like that. So it's grown. We also all serve as reviewers for the conference and have done that for a long time. I want to say we've submitted posters, short papers, full papers, practice and design papers. Hillary and I are meta reviewers or senior reviewers. So that means when you submit to ISLS, you get hopefully at least 3 reviews, and a senior reviewer looks over those and puts together a summary and a recommendation on whether it should be accepted or, accepted with room. And Gayatri, I'm losing my notes here, is this year she's co-chairing the pre-conference workshop sessions. So she'll be in evaluating a lot of those. And last year she was on the best papers jury, so she has insight into those processes. Okay, so that is what we have in common. I'm going to introduce them a little bit. Hillary is an associate professor in my department at Utah State University. So she's a colleague I'm privileged to work with. Her undergraduate degree is in physics from Colorado College, and she taught high school math, chemistry, and physics for 6 years before doing her doctorate at Berkeley and a postdoc at Northwestern at the Center for Connected Learning and Computer-Based Modeling and the Tangible Design and Interaction and Learning Lab. I think I got some of those words wrong, but that was a mouthful of a lab title.
2 different labs. That's why it was so long.
Each of them gave me notes specific to ISLS, so I'm going to highlight some of their notes. In some years, Hillary has submitted 10 ISLS papers and had all 10 accepted, and some years have had submitted like 10 papers and maybe only had 1 accepted at half the length, like from a full paper to a short paper. Okay, so we have the range here. Hillary's amazing at training her doctoral students in papers, and last year 2 of her doctoral students were nominated for best student paper, so that's very exciting. And she's also an associate editor for Instructional Science, which is an international journal of the learning sciences. So Gayatri is an Indian scholar who did her PhD and master's degree in learning sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, where I got to work with her some when she was a student. She did a postdoc at the University of Oregon and is now an assistant professor of computer science education in the College of Ed at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's been writing ISLS submissions since a grad student, short and long papers, and I told you some more importantly, she has now started collaborating with high school teachers in data analysis and writing for ICLS. And I got to see some teachers that I had worked with who helped her on a paper at the last conference, which was a joy. So those are our introductions. I have some questions that I prepared for us. And then we will have at least 20 minutes for everyone else to ask questions. So as you have questions, maybe write them down, see if we answer them. And if we don't answer them, then feel free to bring them up, okay? And you can write them in any language because we have, obviously we have ample translation available. So my first question, I love asking about stories. So I'm going to ask for a standout memory of preparing something for ISLS. And either one of you can go first.
I can go first, just so that we get started. And it's also funny because it's related to Debbie here. This was from the time she was mentoring me to write one of my first long papers for the Learning Sciences Conference. And I was a doctoral student, and I had done all this analysis. This, I think, was about students debugging e-textile projects.
I remember it.
And once you start doing all the analysis as a student, especially, right, you want to write about everything that you're seeing. So I had, I'm sure, like much longer than 8 pages. And then we were inching closer to the deadline. And then we had to sit and do the editing. And I still take away so much from remembering that process of how we had to cut down details just to bring up like the most salient things. And again, not salient 4 or 5 things, 1 or 2 things, and just provide enough evidence to convince the readers that this is important. So that still kind of sticks with me. This was, I even have the paper in front of me, 2019 ISLS. So yeah, I'll stop at that and happy to take any questions.
Hillary?
That's a sweet memory, Gayatri. Thanks for sharing. And I'll follow with a happy memory I have from preparing for ISLS was with my graduate students a few years ago. We all decided to get together and co-write sort of maybe the weekend before I would have asked them to all share their drafts with me, and then I would give them feedback. So it's sort of to get each other through that final push. And everyone brought food to share with everyone else. And we met on campus and we stayed there all day. And everyone came at 9 a.m. and we stayed till 6 p.m. We ate lunch together. We chatted a little bit, but we all kind of sat there with our headphones working and I just really loved it. It was because it can be a lonely process to be alone writing and just in your own head, sort of spiraling around. And how do you cut that data down, Gayatri? But if you're there with your friends, your colleagues, it can make it a fun party-like event. So that was a great memory.
And my memory is similar to Gayatri's. It was my first full paper for ISLS that I remember working on. I was a second-year doctoral student, and I remember being in a room with Yasmin Kafai, and I was working on her data, and David Feldon, who's now also in my department, Hillary knows David, who was a postdoc at the time, and a couple of other students, and we were trying to figure out, I'm like, I have 3 ideas of how to analyze this data that's very confusing on kids playing in a virtual world in a club, an after-school club. And they helped me figure out which was going to be the most interesting for the audience. The audience was CSCL that year. Now we have ICLS and CSCL every year, but it used to be those years alternated. And that paper ended up getting best student paper. I got money for writing that paper. My first full paper. It hasn't happened since. Happened for a student I worked with. But I want to highlight that all 3 of us brought up community in these memories. And that is one thing that I think is very important. I work with a lot of students who think that the hard work of doing science and research and writing is individual, but no. These are social communities. ISLS is a community of people, as Sharon has highlighted, right? And we are writing to those people who review the papers, and we have our papers reviewed too. So that people are a core part of some of our deepest memories of this, I think, is a very important thing. Okay, so now I'm going to have a second story, only the second story, of a memory you have of presenting at ISLS. Okay, I'll go first. My first ISLS, before the full paper, I submitted a poster. It was in Indiana, and I remember James Greeno presenting a poster, 2 posters down from me. And Hillary's jaws dropped, because if you're familiar with sociocultural theory or even cognitive theory, James Greeno is like a big, huge figure. And there he was presenting a poster. And to me, that helped legitimize that posters are legitimate forms of sharing scholarly work, whatever stage in your career you're at. Sometimes we can tend to diminish, oh, the bigger the paper, the more important it is. But posters are a wonderful place to share early work, to share new ideas, and it was really cool. Gayatri, Hillary, do you have any memories of presenting, or maybe a conference where you just, maybe something happened after the presentation?
Well, I'm just going back and forth between which story I'm going to share, but maybe based on yours, I remember, I think a few years ago, we had a conference in Montreal, I think, and not very many people showed up to my presentation. It was a full paper. I prepared, and it might have just been myself, the other presenters, and 3 other people who showed, and my graduate students who all came to support me. So 8 people in the audience or something, but 2 of them happened to be big name scholars, and I won't mention their names, but one of them, the theory, I was presenting a theory I had been working on, and I was building on epistemic forms and games by Collins and Ferguson, 1993. And Bill Ferguson's former office mate was one of the people who showed up. Anyhow, these 2 scholars gave me a run for my money. It didn't matter. There was no one else in the room. It was fantastic. They asked incredibly hard questions and pushed my thinking forward a lot. And initially, I was like, well, this is going to be easy. No one's here except for my students. They're going to ask me softball questions because they want me to look good, But no, these 2 scholars asked really incredibly hard questions, and they knew very well the theories that I was building on. So it was fun. I walked out feeling slightly thrilled and slightly like I was going to faint. But
Thank you.
There's my story.
Yeah. I think if I were to, again, I was like debating between 2 different stories, but I think I'll pick the one that is more recent, and also something that kind of connects to what both of you have said, in that ISLS is such a community, and it is a very welcoming community. And I say that because this year we traveled with 4 of our co-author teachers that Debbie was talking about, and they were in the room when we were presenting. And I was anxious in a lot of different ways, right? Because when you're preparing, you're presenting their perspectives. It's the data that you would have analyzed with them, but you also want to be careful because they're in the room, but they're also veteran teachers, like, I don't know, 15, 20 years plus of teaching experience. And I'm here trying to present. And this is their first time in the learning sciences. So they may be familiar with these theories, but it's not like they're reading a journal paper every morning. So I was like wondering how that whole thing would go. But the Q&A session was like so good. And we had a bunch of other teachers who had come in And these teachers had recruited many other people to come in for their session. And the whole Q&A just became about how they did this work and what they felt and what they took away, which was beautiful. So it kind of like, you may think of learning sciences as this very theory heavy, focused on like knowledge building, but that use inspired theory. I think that really was resonating as teachers were like, they walked away feeling so good about the conference. They felt very welcoming. In fact, one of the teachers from Wisconsin, I think she met with some game designing faculty, like, and they were like striking some chord about doing the research in her classrooms. There was a lot going on, more than what I could grapple. So all to say, yes, it has this projection, but I think it has also been very inviting as the tent that you can see from outside. It has been actively expanding in how it thinks about itself and theories, whom it invites to build this knowledge together.
Thank you. Okay, we were asked to share things that would help people in preparing for the conference. Deadline is October 9th, and I have been told there will be no extensions. None. So, by the way, that's your preview. So I would love each of us to share 3 best practices that you would give for people preparing for ISLS, things that maybe you do regularly, things that you tell your students. And some of ours might overlap. I don't know. But yeah, please share 3, and then we'll have time. I'm sure other advice will come up as well.
Gayatri, do you want to go first?
I can go with 1 or 2, and then maybe we can take turns
Sure,
or
we can
mix
take
them up
turns.
also. I think for me, the biggest takeaway that, again, maybe this year is not the best of the years to highlight this, but to leave enough room for getting feedback and review from others. And even like as an Indian person doing a lot of cooking in the kitchen, letting things sit and ferment and then coming back to it with fresh eyes and having others' eyes over your writing just lets so many more things come up. And that's something you can catch before reviewers will have to tell that for you. So yes, leave enough room, involve a lot of people. I think with that, I take 2 of mine.
I like those. And I'm glad you said those ones, Gayatri, because I wrote down 6 pieces of advice because I was just brainstorming. And the 2 that you said related to some of the ones that I came up with, but now I can give the other ones. And you said them much more eloquently too. I just wrote collaborate, get feedback, So that was really nice how you put all that. But I think, so the 2 that I'll share really come from being a meta reviewer for ISLS and being a journal associate editor. I feel like from seeing reviewers' reactions to what authors are submitting, I've sort of been able to abstract and categorize what are the key things that gets papers accepted or rejected, either to journals or to conferences. And I'd say there are 2 really big, these are very practical. These are not social. These are just straight up writing tips. The first is make your contribution clear. What are you adding to the discussion? What's the discussion going on? What are you adding? Why is your contribution important? How is it new? How does it extend the discussion? And so how does it compare to what others have previously said? So I have just seen so many reviewers react to papers that have been written that go through a beautiful analysis, but don't position the findings as making a contribution that pushes the discussion forward. And if you don't have that, reviewers will sometimes just kind of give up on reviewing the paper entirely and say, it's not clear what the contribution is, reject. So don't fall into that category. It's just a writing thing. Just make sure you say it. And I say it's just a writing thing, make sure you say it. It takes hours and hours and hours and hours of work to figure that out because you have to read a ton of literature. You have to figure out what literature it is that you're responding to, what they're saying you have to synthesize that and you have to pull out what's missing or what opportunities are being presented in that literature. So that's like totally non-trivial and can take you a year to do. But that's super duper important. And the second piece of advice is to make the logic of your inquiry clear. So what do I mean by that? How do your research questions grow out of the needs and opportunities revealed by prior research? That's what you just spend a year figuring out. What's your, how is your work responding to the needs of the community? How is your research informed by theory? How are your methods appropriate for addressing your questions? How do your findings answer your research questions? How do your findings contribute to the scholarly discussion? What are the implications for theory, design, and practice? And this point kind of relates to in Sharon's talk, how she was saying your conceptions of learning sort of drive what kind of research questions you'd ask, what methods you would use, what counts as evidence. But the logic of the inquiry needs to be this coherent logic of like, I'm interested in these things, therefore I drew on this theory to look at this thing. I used these methods to collect this data and analyze the data in this way to then answer my research questions, and it's allowed me to support this argument. And so that logic of the inquiry needs to be coherent. Everything needs to be stacking, and it can't just be, I have a theory over here and I have methods over here, and the relationship between them is not clear. It may even be that there's a clear relationship between them and you know it and it's implicit, but I like to use the analogy of when I was a high school teacher, and you have to be so careful to write down every step in a math solution. If you're solving a problem here to the next step, to the next step, to the next step, because if you just say, like the math textbooks always do, they say, here's where we started, and it follows ... that you arrive at this conclusion. And then if you're like me as a student, you're going, how did you get there? I have no idea. So there may be a clear logic of the inquiry in your head, but you need to explicitly explain it for your reader, because the readers who are reviewing your papers are likely not going to know the same things that you do, because we are such a broad tent, as Sharon was saying, and Gayatri was just reiterating, that I could do work from a knowledge and pieces perspective, but Debbie, who's coming from a constructionist perspective or a more sociocultural perspective, might be like, I don't know what you're talking about. So you need to explain it to me. Anyhow, I'll be quiet now and hand it back to Gayatri. Share as many other points as you want, because I'm sure you're going to catch all of the other ones I have.
Something came up and then I forgot. Debbie, I'm sure you have some, right?
I have one, and
Yeah.
it's a spin on what Hillary just said.
Mm.
And it's related to what I pointed out earlier, that this is a community and we do this for people. I like to approach papers as an educator. Surprise. So you have to teach people, your readers, who have never seen your work before and may have different expertise, albeit in the learning sciences. You have to explain to them why this is important. You have to build on their knowledge. If you're a teacher and you go into the classroom, you'd better get to know your students and what they know so you can build on it. That's what the literature review is. You're saying, let me show you what we know in the field. I know so you had better be researching learning sciences literature to frame your paper to the learning sciences, right? And different for different audiences if you're applying to other conferences or other journals. And then as everyone has said, you have to communicate what it means. I had one professor when I was a grad student, Bill Sandoval, who would always say, every research meeting we had, so what? And I hated that question so much, but it's such an important question. Now I find myself asking myself that and my students that, like, so what? All right, you did all this work. What's the point? So you have to be able to explain that point, building on people's knowledge. You're educating them about this amazing work you've done. And that question is not easy to answer, as Hillary pointed out. It is, that's why we spend so much time writing these papers, to explain why is this nuanced finding that you did in this classroom or with this technology so important. So, Gayatri, did
And
you have another
yeah,
one you want to share?
just one last thing. That was like a revelation for me, like growing in the learning sciences. And Hillary and Debbie, you both can tell me if this is or how accurate this is. But I think learning sciences over the years has been leaning a lot more on the process of learning, not so much on the product of learning. So, oh, there is a pre-test and then there's a post-test. Here is what we saw students gained. Sure, it's exciting, but what actually happened between that pre and post is what learning sciences community would love to hear. So to a point where, of course, right, you can tell a whole nice story with the pre and the post. And I had one such paper. This was 2022. I had submitted it as a long paper, but it was pre and post with like about 20 plus kids, high school students, before they did some e-textiles and after, I think, or something like that. But it had 8 pages worth of things, but the reviewers were like, but we are interested in the process. Tell us more about what happened when students were working with these. Like, we want to see what actually transpired. And therefore, I was asked to cut it down to like a 4-pager, and I was easily able to, which kind of speaks to that there is a lot that happens in the process of learning that I think excites learning sciences community more than the products, than just the end products that we may see in our contexts. And that is why it gets like so interesting in that, oh, here is how students were interacting or teachers were interacting. And here are different things that happened, like, learning and action. So it could be something related to physical movements or something related to utterances or something related to how like an artifact was moving around in the class, or what what that space felt like even. So that is something that I recognized. And since then, my methodology also, of course, then shifted in focusing more on the interactions, like what, people have been doing, as opposed to not solely relying only on, let's say, the interviews, unless there is something else that you're trying to draw from those interviews. But I don't know, but both of you can tell a little more about that.
Those are awesome. I can add a few more tips.
Yeah,
Because you were coming up with things I didn't think of, so that's awesome. Okay, under collaborate, in addition to getting feedback from people, I think it can be a good strategy, especially anytime in your career, but especially when you're getting started and you're new, to submit more than one paper by collaborating with friends, colleagues, and mentors, where each of you gets to be a lead author on one of the, we do this in my lab a lot, where maybe 3 or 4 of us will get together and each one of us will lead a paper. And then because we're all collecting data from the same project, we'll help each other analyze it. And then we'll each lead a different paper. I'll lead a paper and then 3 graduate students will lead a paper. And then we'll all be trailing authors on that same paper, on each other's papers, so that we can help out with the analysis, we can help out with the writing, we can give feedback. But also then, instead of submitting one paper, we're all submitting 4 papers. So we've much improved our chances of getting accepted to the conference, because then you can actually go to the conference if you weren't a first author, but the one you were on, you can go watch your friend present it, and then you can get a sense for what is it like? And in our department, students can get help funding themselves to go to the conference if they're an author on a paper, whether or not they're presenting authors. So that really helps them actually get to the conference, because you can network at a conference regardless of whether or not you're a presenting author on a paper. So, but also in that process of collaborating, everyone has different styles. Some people are trying to make an argument, and some people are doing a straight up pretty empirical analysis with a finding that's a contribution at the end. And it's like, that had never even occurred to me when I first started. So it's neat to learn from other people. And then, as both Gayatri and Debbie were mentioning, then it's nice to do that kind of stuff with some lead time so everyone can give each other a lot of round feedback. Because that's where, I mean, it's in the editing that you really learn a lot. Okay, I have some other thoughts, but anyone want to jump in before I move on to some other tips? Okay, I'll just finish. Volunteer as a reviewer. Sign up to review for the conferences and the journal that belong to the communities you want to be a part of. The more you review for these communities, the more you will develop a sense for the discussion the communities are having. And that's really important. I think there's two sides to that. One is you're sort of more likely to get something accepted if people can relate to what you're doing and they're like, this is an important topic. We understand the value of it. You don't need to convince us so much. Everyone's talking about it. But on the other hand, maybe you want to bring in brand new ideas and innovate, and that's important too. So don't constrain yourself to only limiting your research agenda to what you see other people funding right now and publishing right now, because you may have some new creative idea or direction that pushes the field forward, and you should by all means share it. I think our community really gets excited by new ideas. So definitely sign up to help review though. Also, the more you review the work of others, the more insight you gain into the features of strong writing. This is even true if the papers are not in your area of expertise. I feel like my writing has just gotten so much better over the years, in large part because I read so many incoming conference submissions and I look at the reviewers' responses to them and I see what problems they're picking out and what they're liking and what's getting accepted and what's not getting accepted. And the same thing in a journal, just, you know, because I have no idea. A lot of these papers are way out of my area of expertise. I don't do experimental research. I don't do quantitative methods, and I read reactions of reviewers to these papers that looked really clear to me if I understood what they were talking about. But then they'll point out all sorts of flaws and they'll give them advice for improving it. So I feel like if you get involved in the review process, it will only make your writing exponentially stronger. Plus, we need more reviewers. We always need more reviewers. So that's a little pitch. And then the last point, anyone else, either of you want to jump in? Did you think of anything? Okay, just don't give up. Don't give up. I feel that academia is who succeeds. It's a game of who's the last person standing at the end of all the rejections. Because I don't know, Gayatri, Debbie, like raise your hand if you feel like you've gotten so many more rejections than you know, acceptances, so many more, tenfold, hundredfold, you know.
Yeah.
So it's really a game of where resilience comes in handy, and you just have to keep trying and keep trying and keep, and like Debbie said, I've had years where my graduate students and I have submitted 10 papers and amazingly gotten them all accepted, and I'm a little blown away by that, but we did work hard on them. And then 2 years ago, we submitted 10 papers and only one paper got accepted at half length. And it was like a stake through my heart. And I thought, I don't ever want to submit anything again to this conference. They hate me, you know. But then we submitted something last year and 2 of the students' papers got nominated for best papers. So I was like, it's really just random, you know, because a lot of times the reviewers that get assigned to your paper don't think like you do. They're in a different adjacent area and they're doing their best, but they, you know, maybe they like it or they don't. And you can get great feedback from them and improve your work, but also don't take it personally because it's just a little bit of game of chance. And so that's why don't ever give up. Just keep going, picking yourself back up, dusting yourself off and moving forward because you have something valuable to share. And over time, the more you try sharing, the more your work will get picked up and recognized. And it's hard. So I guess Debbie was saying community is a fundamental theme. That's why having a strong community support system can be so important because they can affirm you in your value, even when you feel like you're being screamed at by reviewers who just hate your work, you know? So, but that happens to all of us. And, you know, even those of us I've now been submitting to ICLS for 17 years, and I can say that I still feel a stake through my heart with reviews. So, and I have a parting gift after all of that, all of my advice I wanted to share with all of you, although this will need to be translated. now I realize, but I'm going to put into the chat to share freely. And, Gayatri, feel free to pass it on to your networks and share with anyone and fix it, remix it. But this is the template that I developed based on the ICLS reviewer criteria, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I haven't checked it. Maybe it's updated. But even it has like the font size and font type, and it's got prompt questions. But I've developed this for myself, because you sit down at a blank piece of paper and you don't know where to start. And it just goes through and it has the sections that ICLS expects to see: an introduction, theory, methods, findings. And then it has little prompts of what I have seen over the years people put in that, who do well. So it's not necessarily that I thought these things up. I just have sort of abstracted from all of the reading that I've done. And so it's by no means perfect, and I'm sure you can all improve upon it. But I think that the template is a helpful place to start. So, and I just feel like it's hard enough to write a paper that makes sense. I don't feel that I'm giving away, the thing that makes, our lab successful. The thing that's going to make your paper successful is that you're able to communicate the importance of your idea and the logic of your inquiry and speak to that community, as Debbie was saying, and teach them. But we should level the playing ground and just say, here's just start with, make sure you say these things. So go for it.
Have to pause for questions, but Hillary's comment on sometimes reviewers say things, and I'm going to say most of our learning sciences reviewers are very good and focused on mentorship, but occasionally, and this is Paulo and I, when we wrote our book, we got reviews, and one was super enthusiastic, the one I cared about. And then our editor actually apologized for the reviews. We still had to read them and did help us improve. So this is a mug that says reviewer comments. Paulo memorialized some of our reviewer comments on the mug, and it says, "I was enormously disappointed." This is after writing out an entire book. And the other side says, "None of my expectations were addressed or answered." It took us a little while to recover from those. And actually, I don't think they were very good, but we used them. So no one is alone. All right, we need to take some questions.
Can I just add one last thing?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're also talking about like pushing the boundaries in the community and doing this as a community work. I was just reminded of the 2 symposia, I think, that happened just last ISLS, Voices from the Global South, where the contexts in which we work may look and feel different from the papers that we may read. And you may feel like, oh, this is a different thing that I'm seeing. How do I make this fit within the theories that I've been reading? Or it does not fit. How forcefully should I make it fit for the sake of this paper or the audience? So I felt that those 2 symposia, I think one was speaking about doing research as relational, coming from like Global South Voices, from Macy et al. And the other one was where Paulo was also part of, led by Sahana Murthy. Again, another perspective from Global South, where they were talking about what it means to work within this community with the theories we have, while not shying away from what may emerge from the context. So maybe those 2 could also be a place to start. Like, if you have not looked at it already, if it has not come up for you for you yet, highly encourage that. I feel like that gives some language to really make your contribution shine, even if it feels and looks different, because new context should have new things to look at and new ways of thinking about things. So just, I felt very encouraged by those 2 symposia. So, yeah, thank you. I think now we can really open for questions.
All right, so I see one hand raised, and then if you have questions, you can put them into chat, and Cassia will help translate and also look for commonalities in the questions. Esmeralda, do you want to share your question?
Sí, Aí eu posso falar em português e você me interpreta, José? Eu gostaria de vocês se puderem compartilhar exemplos concretos de temas, de possibilidades de apresentar. Por que estou fazendo essa pergunta? Porque talvez aqui neste grupo existem muitas disciplinas, distintas profissões, e estamos nos achegando nessa temática de ciências das aprendizagens. E eu, por exemplo, eu sou economista, mas trabalhei por muitos anos com o desenvolvimento infantil e os impactos que a creche ou as práticas parentais e todo esse processo de desenvolvimento cognitivo, socioemocional na infância. Mas assim, na parte que eu tenho trabalhado muito, tem sido muito quantitativo. Então, para mim, está sendo um pouco difícil me desafiar a que tipo de proposta posso fazer, porque no meu campo sempre é muito estatística, muito rigor, são documentos muito longos, ou com muito rigor metodológico em termos estatísticos. Então, para eu não ficar presa e poder ampliar meu horizonte, gostaria que vocês tocassem em alguns exemplos que nos ajudem a entender. Porque talvez a gente tem experiências, coisas, mas a gente não ache valor, sabe? A gente, não, mas, talvez não. E fiquemos com essa questão sem apresentar, porque achamos que não atingimos algum nível. Então, seria bom que vocês contassem exemplos de coisas que talvez de distintas coisas. Alguns têm métodos, ou métodos mais simples, de quantitativo, outros não precisam ser tão quantitativos. Como é que, se vocês puderem compartilhar da experiência de vocês?
Before, maybe we have time to share a couple, but I recommend looking at last year's proceedings, and I'm sure we can get a link in the document. There's actually 3 PDF files, they're publicly available, and skim the titles, because you're going to see a far bigger range than the 3 of us could tell you. And there is room for rigorous, good quantitative methods. I think the key that Gayatri mentioned is that context is really important to the learning sciences. It kind of sprang out of educational psychology that kept pulling students out to study people in isolated forms. But we understand from our theories of learning that people learn in community, in physical contexts, all those things that Sharon mentioned. I don't know where even to start with topics because there's so many.
Well, also it sounded like, Esmeralda, it sounded like you were studying interesting things and that those just might be appropriate, like just to focus on a question within that data, and it's fine to use statistics. I do qualitative methods in my research, but I collaborate with people who do statistical analyses so that I can have a more mixed methods approach. And I think there's an appreciation in our field for statistical methods. So if you have a research question that you find interesting, maybe the one thing to do is to look at the work you're already engaged in and think, what would it be exciting to me to share with this community? And like Gayatri was saying, not just context, but the process of learning, if there's, ways to kind of think about the process of change or development, or the process, or to use the word Sharon was using, processes of embodiment and relationality and interaction. And I don't know what your data looks like, but
I can just maybe also come from give an example of how this looked, because I work with teachers And it's like its own world. You get there and you can forget learning sciences, and you can still get a lot of your balls moving all the time because it's a busy world with teachers. They're in classrooms, they're teaching multiple things, something changes in each of their schools, and then you are caught up in that whole thing all the time. And yet we do research with them. And then to decide what is worthwhile bringing to the learning sciences community is something that we grapple with on an year by year basis, right? Because I just go with them for anything that they're doing together. Oh, they're sitting down to reflect on something. Okay, I just go in on my Zoom and turn on the recorder. They're co-designing something. Okay, if my schedule permits, I just go jump into that session and record. But not everything is what we will be looking at. And it can be very overwhelming when there is that much of data coming from practice. So a question or to look at what we could answer, or what would be a good thing for the learning sciences community to grapple with. So for example, when teachers were reflecting, it felt so valuable last time. After co-designing for so long, they were reflecting on their experiences. So what really emerged in that was when we looked at the transcripts of those sessions was, oh, okay, they designed something, but they're highlighting how important it was to have relationships established before they sat down to design, and how important it was to reflect on their experiences for them to take away something from the design process other than what they really designed. They designed lessons and activities, sure, but for their own personal growth and identity development, it was important that they were reflective of that work. So in this, there was a story. And that is kind of where we were like, okay, now I think we have a solid story to tell the learning sciences community, which is so invested in learning about co-design processes, but it happens in this kind of a relational context, and that teachers find value in reflecting on this. And how did we know that this was a good story to tell? Was we were, of course, like having our ears on the co-design literature. What are people who are co-designing talking about co-designing with teachers, or generally with youth, with educators, with, or a more broader set of interdisciplinary teams? What are they looking at? What are they bringing to this community? What are some of even like the journal articles more recently in the learning sciences? So that way we had a sense of what the community is talking about. And then we could be like, oh, but here is our contribution to this conversation. We have not really spoken about what teachers get when they reflect on these processes, or how they walk into the space with certain relationships and what that may then do to what they design together. So that is kind of how we were able to then piece out or take out a part of the data, then look at it with the teachers together. It was their own transcript. And then, okay, are we doing this accurately? And then they gave us some feedback. And again, right, we did the theory part, and then they did the story writing and the analysis part. They helped us make sure that we were representing the story right. And then there was that paper. So just one example of how that something that may feel messy in practice can kind of show up as a paper which is decently packaged.
Cassia, do we have time for another question, or I want to acknowledge that you wanted 10 minutes for closing?
I don't think we need 10 minutes for closing, so if we have one more question, we could do it. I don't see people in the chat asking anything. If anyone wants to make the last question in the chat, I'll give some seconds. Otherwise, we can go to the closing remarks. The paper. Oh, thank you, Gayatri. Awesome. Yeah. Eu acho que a sugestão de abrir os proceedings e olhar o que tem sido publicado ali e também dar uma olhada no Journal of the Learning Sciences e os journals da área, não se assustem, é um pouco assustador para quem não é da área, às vezes, ver. Os papers são muito longos, muito profundos, né? Então, o que é esperado na conferência, obviamente, não é nesse nível de detalhe, mas é interessante para vocês verem, terem um panorama mais geral do que as pessoas têm discutido, né? Que lentes que têm sido usadas para se olhar para a aprendizagem. Então, acho que olhar para o journal é um caminho interessante também. E
Cássia, dá licença, eu ia comentar que a Deb deu um spoiler para uma tarefa que vem em um dos próximos módulos, que é de justamente buscar papers em proceedings de anos anteriores. Então, você vai estar... Deb sabia de alguma coisa, mas acho que tem importância buscar o histórico, né? O que se fala na conferência, qual é a linguagem, métodos, enfim, isso é tudo parte de aos pouquinhos começar a participar da comunidade, né, das Learning Sciences.
Uhum. O George está perguntando qual é o tema de 2027 da conferência, não sei se vocês sabem. E eu queria perguntar, na perspectiva de vocês, como revisoras, é uma pergunta um pouco capciosa, talvez. Qual é a relevância do tema para a revisão que os revisores fazem? Porque eu já vi, né, às vezes as pessoas muito preocupadas, assim, mas o meu trabalho não se encaixa no tema desse ano, né? É, será que eu mando? Será que eu não mando? Então, eu não, né, eu acredito que o tema talvez é algo mais global, mas que nenhum paper vai ser rejeitado por não estar no tema, mas queria ouvir a perspectiva de vocês sobre isso. Act local, think global. Então, haja localmente, pense globalmente, contextualizando o design, aprendizagem e as tecnologias. Thank you. E então, se vocês quiserem falar um pouquinho sobre isso, e falar talvez cada uma, né, uma palavra final, uma mensagem final para os participantes.
I'll mention my take on the conference theme. If you have something that relates to the conference theme, fabulous. Then maybe that should make it into part of your paper that, hey, this is in line with the conference theme. This might be especially appropriate for a symposium where you're gathering people together. However, I guarantee, at least the groups that I've been a part of, if you have a good paper for the learning sciences, you should just submit it.
Uhum.
So the conference theme should not be a barrier to submission.
Yeah.
Hillary and Gayatri, do you want to give your one final short thing and then I'll come up with something too?
Gayatri, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I almost feel like the theme is kind of written to invite work from the global south to really like complicate that dichotomy. Is the world really north and south, or is there more? Bring in that contextualization. What is it that you are noticing? So I think this would be a good opportunity to sit with those things that are kind of like, oh, does not fit into a theory, or it fits into a theory, but it also extends it this way. So I think this would be a good time to do that work, contextualizing work, elaborating, having narratives. And so as of now, I think this is an opportunity to write.
And I think I'm just going to make a general point because I agree with what Gayatri and Debbie said about the conference theme. So I'll just be more broad. And I guess, what are we doing being scholars? Part of it is we're developing our own voice and our own intellectual identity. And we're learning. We're learning to be learning scientists. And we're changing the way that we think through the interactions and relationships that we have with the people in our community. And so I would say, don't worry about if your papers get accepted, but think, I'm going to use the paper as an opportunity to write down what I think is important and how I'm thinking about something. And then I'm going to share it. And there are no desk rejects in ICLS, so you're going to get 3 thoughtful reviews plus a meta review. So you're going to start putting your ideas into interaction with other people's ways of looking at the world and thinking about things. And that'll give you feedback to think about. Do I agree with them? Do I want to incorporate any of that feedback? Or am I going to become more firm and clear in what I'm saying so that people understand what's really important, what I want to hold on to? So I think it's a really beautiful process. And watching graduate students go through that and get clearer and clearer in their intellectual identity, and just reflecting on my own development from being a high school teacher to now being a scholar in the learning sciences. And if you can just kind of zoom out and enjoy that process and be like, this is pretty cool. I'm also learning and I'm developing an identity continually. It never stops. So it's kind of a cool thing. So maybe just embrace that, and then sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, so just don't worry about it.
Thank you.
Enjoy the process.
My concluding comment would be a reminder that science and the learning sciences is social. It's done by humans. Science is a human set of work. And in doing so, a lot of our feedback has been talk with people about what's interesting to this particular community. Get reviews before you submit to the conference, and then learn from your submissions, like Hillary has just said. And hopefully we get to see you at the conference, either virtually or in person, and learn with and alongside you. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Muito obrigada, Debbie, Hillary, Gaitri. A gente aprendeu muito com vocês, eu com certeza
Thank you.
aprendi. Tenho certeza que o pessoal aprendeu também. Isso vai ser muito útil para o pessoal fazer as submissões, e a gente espera que possa encontrar vocês, muita gente daqui possa encontrar vocês também nas próximas conferências, pessoalmente. Obrigada, gente. Obrigada mesmo pelo tempo de vocês.
All the best with all the submissions. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Debbie, for moderating. Casey and Renata, thanks a lot for the invite. And Hillary, it was lovely.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Paulo says thank you
Thanks for
too.
inviting.
Oh, thank you. As for all the
Tchau, pessoal.
submissions. It's
Yeah, thank you.
coming. October is here.
Oh my gosh, it's so soon.
Tchau, pessoal. Obrigada. Até a próxima.